In this video, I'm not just talking about Zoro's swords or the Pacifista, we're gonna dive into the ancient weapons like Pluton and Uranus, the cursed Kitetsu blades, Vegapunk's cloning experiments, all the different sword ranks, and the mysterious Iron Giant from 900 years ago, and that's really just the tip of it because at the bottom of this iceberg, we will hit all the most obscure lore and theories surrounding weapons in the story. That the ancient kingdom was a tech superpower, that devil fruits were built as weapons originally, and that the One Piece world itself might be the aftermath of a global war of destruction using weapons of, well, mass destruction. Let's start slow and breezy here at the top layer of the iceberg, which I'm gonna call the tip of the blade. Now let's be real here, because when it comes to weapons in One Piece, there's just no better place to start than with swords. From the very first time that Zoro took out these three blades here, Oda has made it very crystal clear, I think, that swords in this world aren't just sharp sticks of metal, they are absolute legendary weapons. And the variety is quite insane. One Piece has everything from razor-sharp katanas to massive swords the size of buildings to cursed blades that practically drip with bad vibes and special powers. There are some giant swords the size of entire buildings, tiny blades that look harmless until they slice up main characters, and then of course some absolutely mythical swords wielded by some of the all-time strongest characters in the entire show. But the hype doesn't of course stop with Zoro. It barely even starts with him. Dracula Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman for instance, carries Yoru, a massive black blade where just the sight of that thing screams that there is really something special about this bad boy here. Then we have Whitebeard, the man called the strongest in the world, and his famous blade, Murakomogiri, which is a naginata that could split the sea in half with a single swing, looks pretty impressive as well. So already we do have some truly insane variety just within the most famous blades in the world, and we haven't even scratched the surface of some of the wildest weapons in the story, no pun intended. But here's maybe the wildest part for me. One Piece has its very own sword ranking system called the Meto system, which I don't know why I love, I know everyone else loves. It's such a minor detail, but so cool, and we definitely have to go through it. This Meto system here basically has 4 tiers. At the top we have the so-called 12 supreme great blades, the strongest, the creme de la creme of swords, with for example Mihawk's Yoru here, or the massive Naginata Murakomogiri that we just talked about. And right below the supreme great blades are 21 great swords, great, that's 2 different words, 2 of which belong to Zoro with Enma and the Wado Ichimonji. Next up we've got 50 so-called skillful great blades, which we'll actually discuss in a lot more detail deeper down the iceberg, and then finally we have the just basic graded swords. And we don't know exactly how many of these actually exist, but they are still pretty elite in their own way better than your average sword that no one even knows about. These usually do have names. But what these 50 usually are not better than is the next real weapon. We're gonna talk about a true pirate classic, guns in One Piece. And you know, some other long-range weapons and projectiles. The story at this point is absolutely full of them, and they are also pretty iconic even compared to swords. There's the big boys like cannons, which are absolutely everywhere, pirate ships, marine warships, even smaller boats have them. They're all packing some pretty deadly firepower, and if you're a devil fruit user, you might just get sunken by one of these bad boys without ever being able to do anything about it. Then of course we have just the more classic guns like rifles and pistols, and some of the more famous users of pistols like this are people like Yasop, the sniper for Shanks' crew, who can hit targets that you didn't even know existed from miles and miles away. Or Ben Beckman, Shanks' right-hand man, who somehow terrifies admirals just by aiming a single pistol at them too. Which to this day is just insanely hype, because dodging a bullet should be an absolute cakewalk for the top tiers of the One Piece world, especially with Haki and even advanced future sight Haki too. But guns aren't the only players in the projectile category. No, One Piece is full of other long-range weapons too. Just look at Usopp. Our long-nosed boy here wants to be a master sniper, just like his old man of course, but he's not gonna use a gun. No way, that is way too easy and not kids-friendly enough. No, I'm just kidding about that last one, but enter a slingshot, which Usopp has now mastered to such a ridiculous degree, honestly, that it's basically a military-grade weapon of destruction. He fires exploding stars, giant seeds, and all kinds of really crazy and unique projectiles that can destroy almost anything, but also have some other really unique effects like giant plant sprouting, explosions, etc, etc. Now some other characters, but especially the Kuja pirates from Amazon Lily, bring bows to the party too. And then there's the sneakier stuff with long-range weapons like with Big Mom's daughter Flampay and her blowgun, which is perfect for poison attacks that you will never see coming, even though her own brother then decided to stab himself in the gut because he's a real good guy and very honorable and one of the great moments of One Piece. But maybe he also just did it because his sister's already way too loud and obnoxious that you probably would hear her coming from a mile away. And then of course we can't forget Kizaru with his long-range light blasts. This dude is just a walking and talking railgun basically. It's just like bam, laser here and then bam, laser over there. Even Frankie and the government cyborg warriors, the Pacifista, do have lasers now, so pretty soon the final war is just gonna be one giant laser show. One Piece very sneakily and slowly turning into Star Wars. As we'll see, there is even a lightsaber. Alright, but it's time to shelve the small stuff because now let's talk about some of the single largest and most destructive weapons in the entire show. Ships. You know, like Luffy x Nami or Luffy x Hancock. You just throw that one out there and you're gonna start a pretty big battle. No, okay, but for real, ships in One Piece are some insane pieces of weaponry by themselves. You've got the world government ships all decked out with fleets of cannons with enough firepower to destroy an entire island. There are stealthy submarines with deadly torpedoes that can navigate and hide underwater, and of course high-tech ships like the Thousand Sunny, which can launch itself a full kilometer into the air with its very cool but also a little bit questionable looking coup de burst. But hold up though, because if you thought that the Sunny is powerful, then you're gonna be blown away by the next ship here, because the ancient weapon Pluton is supposed to be a ship so powerful that it can quite literally destroy entire islands by itself. Now, we haven't actually seen this ship yet, it's still trapped under Wano, but it and the other ancient weapons Poseidon and Uranus are said to have the power to change and destroy the entire world. And to be fair, one thing that is already absolutely changing the world at this point is technology, because Dr. Vegapunk, the smartest character in One Piece, has basically speedrun the entire Industrial Revolution, and now there are some truly insane futuristic technological tools and weapons in the story that, you know, used to be about pirates sailing on wooden ships. And of course, the world government has been at the center of it all for quite a while too. Together, they've been developing weapons and gadgets that can completely change the game and the power balance of the One Piece world. Just for starters, take Sea Stone here for instance. This stuff is absolutely nuts. In case you don't know, Sea Stone is a natural resource from Wano and it can completely nullify Devil Fruit powers. That's right, someone with a truly powerful and insanely broken Devil Fruit can go from unstoppable force of nature to totally stuck if you hit them with Sea Stone. To give some credit to the government, they were smart enough to make handcuffs out of it to trap Devil Fruit users, and even weapons like Smoker's Jite here are tipped with the material, so he has a good chance against other Devil Fruit users. Basically, if the government really wants to stop a Devil Fruit user at this point, Sea Stone is the first thing they try to use. And then of course, we can't leave the first tier without talking about the Pacifista. These things are cyborg clones of the warlord Kuma turned into absolute battle machines. And they are absolutely deadly obstacles for your everyday pirates because they are stocked up to the brim with laser weapons, super strength, and total obedience to the government. Well, most of the time, because unfortunately for the world government, that total obedience is also in part to Jewelry Bonnie, Kuma's daughter. Now, of course, we also have to mention that these super cyborgs here have had some really impressive upgrades over the years that we'll talk about a little bit deeper down the iceberg, but of course, the world government isn't the only one playing with some technology. Frankie, one of our Straw Hats, is basically a walking weapons lab. For example, he's got his own cola-powered cyborg body, the giant robot form, the Frankie Shogun. He's also outfitted a Thousand Sunny with the coup de burst and all the little vehicles that are hidden within the Sunny. And at first glance, Frankie's tech might be looking like child's play compared to Dr. Vegapunk, but honestly, I personally feel like he might actually be a little bit ahead of him, since Vegapunk is kind of only recreating copying tech from the ancient kingdom, while Frankie seems to be straight up innovating and turned himself into a cyborg at, being a teenager. Nonetheless, I think credit where credit is due, Vegapunk has created some truly wild inventions over the years, including these cyborg sea monsters that greeted the Straw Hats outside of Egghead Island, for instance. Once again, this is really just scratching the surface of what Vegapunk is able to do, so to find out more, we will now have to dive a little bit deeper to the lower levels of the iceberg and beneath the surface. So let's test your knowledge by diving down to level 1 of the iceberg, which is all about weapons, facts, and theories that you absolutely have to know if you are a One Piece fan. And since we already had such a nice transition here, let's just continue with Dr. Vegapunk. The man is basically the Senku Ishigami of One Piece, from Dr. Stone, except instead of building civilization up from nothing, he's out here rewriting the laws of nature and also building civilization up again from nothing. I guess in parts, that kind of works out pretty well actually. Alright, but first let's look again at the pacifista models that we first saw back on Shabani Archipelago and Marineforts. Back then they were already terrifying with super tough bodies that could make a Gomu Gomu pistol look like a Gomu Gomu pop gun. This is what I'm gonna go with here. And don't forget that just a few of these guys basically wiped out the Straw Hats, who at this time had already taken down 2 warlords and an entire group of pro-Cypher Pole agents. These things already had the deadly lasers based on Kizaru's light fruit, so it's almost like they have their own little slice of a devil fruit power on top of everything. But as we'll now get into, Vegapunk took modifying devil fruit powers with one of his most important recent inventions to the next level, which is the green blood here. This tech is an absolute game changer because it can recreate any zone fruit or any paramecia type devil fruit by taking a previous user's lineage factor, which I guess is basically like DNA in One Piece. And I mean, damn, imagine having 5 Gouda Gouda fruits, 5 earthquakes fruit on the battlefield, or I don't know, 5 phoenixes like Marco on the battlefield. Pretty brutal stuff, honestly. Talk about literally a world-destroying technology, just cloning the most broken fruits out there. And even though we've gotten some hints, we still don't really know how it exactly works. We've basically only seen green blood power from the previous warlords who worked for the world government that has been taken, and that's been only used in the Seraphim, which are these genetically modified clones, and on a completely different level, by the way, than the Pacifista even. So who knows, this tech may not even work on a regular person, but we will discuss some really spicy green blood theories a little bit deeper down this iceberg, so we'll circle around back to this one. In the meantime though, we've got a ton more weaponized tech to get through here in tier level 2, and Vegapunk's not the only person out here trying to copy devil fruits. Enter Caesar, Clown, the genius or somewhat genius scientist who's basically a knockoff Vegapunk who sells his science to the highest bidder, usually the bad guys. In case you forgot, he's the guy behind the infamous Smile Fruits, which are artificial devil fruits mass-produced for Kaido's Beast Pirate crew. And let's not beat around the bush here, the process to make these things is straight up horrifying. Caesar developed a chemical called SAD, which mixes together lineage factors from a ton of different animals, which then got shipped off to Dressrosa, where giant fields of trees were sprouted with these fake fruits here. With the chemical being pumped into the water that, was used to grow these trees. But here's the catch. They can only produce zone abilities, which does fit very nicely, of course, with Kaido's entire animal army vibe. That's why you see the gifters and his crew running around with giraffe necks, lion jaws, or sheep horns sticking out of their heads, and some of them just being straight up fused with an animal in really bizarre ways. Now, these Smile Devil fruits are still pretty messed up when compared to real devil fruits, but when they worked, they did turn nobodies into animal-human hybrids with some random animal parts sprouting out anywhere on the user's bodies. And I think this is a good point to shout out my all-time favorite Fortrix right here, who got blessed or cursed to have his head permanently sticking out of a rooster's butt. Nice, peak One Piece. But at least his fruit actually worked, because when these fruit don't work, which is most of the time, the side effects are truly beyond brutal. It means that the people who ate them can never ever express any emotion ever again besides absolutely hysteric laughter. That's of course how the very tragic town of Ibisu came to be in Wano, where everyone smiles and laughs all the time, no matter what type of crazy pain and suffering they're in, just like we see, for example, during Yasuie's execution right here, which leads to a truly haunting moment in the manga and the anime. That is quite literally, by the way, why they are called smile fruits. So I think to cleanse our palate a little bit from the freakiness that are the smile fruits, let's now talk about some more natural weapons, because while Vegapunk and Caesar are out here playing mad scientist, the people of Skypiea already had some of the absolute wildest tech in the entire series: dials. Now, these little seashell-looking gadgets here introduced an entire weapon system to the story when the crew first landed on the Sky Islands. Let's just pick one. Let's start with the impact dial here. This thing can literally absorb the force of any punch and then blast it back at someone with some truly insane power. And this thing turned some regular old Skypieans into dangerous fighters and even gave Usopp a ton of upgrades for his slingshot-based fighting after the arc as well. And we also have the flash dial, which can blind enemies with a burst of lightning, basically like carrying a pocket-sized flashbang around. And those are just the tip of the spear, because there are flame dials for giant shots of fire, breath dials that can shoot gusts of air, and even the jet dial, which can add a burst of speed to any attack. Oh yeah, and of course let's not forget the reject dial, which is kind of like the impact dial, just cranked up to like 1,000,000, which is so powerful it can even take down a powerhouse like Enno here. And that's really what makes dials still so hyped to me, and I kind of wish they were still used in the story more, because they were kind of the first time we saw a completely different way of fighting that wasn't just blades, guns, and devil fruits, and then later hockey. And Skypiea wasn't the only island cooking up some crazy tech in the sky either. Later in the story, we learn about Witheria, a floating cloud island that is home to a serious group of weather scientists. And these guys have some absolute crazy technology too, like weather balls that can trap lightning, wind knots that can store bursts of air, and all kinds of other really cool climate-related gadgets. As you probably know, Nami took full advantage of their knowledge, which is how she then upgraded her Climate Tact to the Sorcery Climate Tact after the time skip. Which means that now in the story, she can make cloud roads, shoot out bigger gusts of wind, fire black lightning bolts, and so much more. In general, I'm always loving it when I get some Nami action in the story recently, but one thing the weather can't do is break into the Meito sword grading system, and so far we've talked about some of the biggest blades like Mihawk's Yoru or Whitebeard's Murakomogiri, but now in level 2, I think it's time to shine a bit of a spotlight on the rest of the supreme and grade blades. And first up, we have the Shodai Kitetsu. This is the original cursed blade, the first in its line of 3 and the ancestor to the other 2 Kitetsu blades too. And while it has not been 100% confirmed yet, we're all pretty certain at this point it is in the hands of the sword-wielding Gorosei, Venus Juru right here, and just imagine how bloodthirsty this blade is gonna be in the story once we see it. Because when you think about it, we've already seen just how wild just the Sandai Kitetsu can be, for which it took a truly excellent and powerful swordsman like Zoro to even try and control it. And that's the weakest one of the 3. Plus, Zoro could sense the Nidai's curse just from being near it. So just imagine how terrifyingly powerful the Shodai must truly be. There's of course a lot more to come from this line of swords, so stick around for later in the Iceberg for some more of these cursed blades, cause things get really weird and broken later on. Instead, now moving on to a non-cursed blade, we have Ace, which is not Luffy's brother, well also yes, but also the sword once owned by the Pirate King Gold D. Roger himself. And yes, in case you were wondering, apparently Roger loved his sword so much he named his son after it. Take that for what you will, I guess. But even though Roger didn't rely on devil fruit powers, his swordsmanship was enough to clash evenly with some absolute monsters like the Yonko Whitebeard. So that alone already makes Ace one of the most legendary blades in the entire story, and as far as we know, it didn't even have a hole punched in it, so I would argue the better of the 2 aces. And then finally, we've got the final supreme grade blade that we know of, the Yakuza Kazen. Now this is the cane sword wielded by the Admiral Fujitora, and okay, let me be real here, when this thing came out as one of the 12 supreme grade swords, I was a little bit taken aback. Like when I think supreme grade, top level stuff, right? My mind kind of goes to swords like Yoru or Whitebeard's blade, but hey, I guess it just goes to show how much of a Chad Fujitora is to have one of the all-time best swords in the entire story. Please come back and do some cool stuff with it, I guess, because I guess we haven't really seen anything, you know, supreme grady from that blade yet. Now, we can of course talk about weapons without bringing up one of the flashiest weapons in all of One Piece. I'm talking about Eustace Captain Kidd's damned punk railgun, where he basically uses his own magnetic devil fruit powers to construct one of the most futuristic, crazy railgun things in the story ever. And even though Kidd is a little bit of a joke, you know, amongst One Piece fans, this thing is honestly pretty freaking powerful. Like, strong enough to blast a Yonko off a floating island. Kidd's railgun shows us what kind of wild weapons can actually be made with devil fruits, but Oda didn't of course stop with that. Instead he was like, hold my beer, and went a step further and made weapons themselves come alive with devil fruits. Yeah, that's right. We're talking now about weapons that have eaten a devil fruit power. Because it turns out, once again thanks to Dr. Vegapunk, that even inanimate objects can eat a devil fruit and gain powers and even sentience. I mean, we've already seen it with Funk Freed, for instance, Spandam's sword that ate an elephant zone fruit. This sword and its powers are basically the only thing that kept Spandam from being completely useless. It's a pretty cute elephant too, so props to that, some points. But then we also have Lasso, Mr. Force Bazooka, that ate a fruit and became a dog. And to be completely real with you here, I feel like this is one of those concepts that Oda introduces that at first feel like a bit of a joke, but that I personally think is just the tip of a massive iceberg by itself and might be super relevant later in the story, because if swords and guns can eat devil fruits, what's stopping someone from feeding a devil fruit to a cannon, a ship, or even an island-level weapon? I mean, honestly, the potential that you can bring inanimate objects to life with devil fruits is kind of off the charts. While we're at it, I'll also throw in a more recent weapon in here with Shamrock's Cerberus sword, which could be another of these swords that eat a devil fruit, but I actually want to get into some much more wild speculation about this sword specifically a little bit further down. We're getting into, you know, deeper level waters with this one. Let's stay a little bit, you know, we're still under the surface. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here. So we just talked about devil fruits eating weapons like Funk Freed and Lasso, but if you think that that's the wildest that Oda's given us, yeah, think again. Because here in level 2 of the iceberg, we're now truly going to the next level with some less known facts and theories about, for instance, the ancient weapons. Starting with Pluton, which we already talked about, and we do know that it's supposed to be some sort of ship, but we kind of have to use this word ship extremely loosely, because what would you even consider to be a ship, right? Is it just some massive giant battleship like the Noah here, or could it be something like a living creature, like, you know, a ginormous cybernetic whale? That's my personal favorite theory, and maybe I'll just make Whale Piece 2.0, you know? I do love them whales in One Piece, but seriously, I just kind of have a feeling that Pluton isn't gonna be as simple as some people might think. Now, you might remember that Frankie had the blueprints to build a second Pluton that he got back in Water 7, and there's been almost constant speculation ever since that Frankie might actually upgrade the Thousand Sunny, or might already have built the Thousand Sunny into a second version Pluton, so that the Straw Hats would basically have a ship on par with the power of an ancient weapon. Which I know is a crazy idea, but let's now jump ship first to Poseidon, and we learned during the Fishman Island arc that this ancient weapon is actually a person with the ability to command the gargantuan Sea Kings, at least in part. This person just happens to be the mermaid princess Shirahoshi, who's a descendant of the original Poseidon, also a mermaid princess dating back to the Void Century. That's the basics, but one question I've always wondered is how she actually commands those Sea Kings. What makes her lineage so special, right? And given everything that we know about the Void Century at this point and the Ancient Kingdom, there is a real chance that the answer is once again related to nothing else but technology. Could very well be some lineage factor shenanigans actually, because just remember that everything Dr. Vegapunk is doing with the lineage factor and genetic modifications right now is based on ancient technology that he got from the library of Ohara. That is still very much speculative though. However, one thing that we do know for sure is that there is something special going on with Poseidon, the Sea Kings, and the ancient giant ship Noah. The Sea Kings, who are very intelligent creatures, seem to think that Poseidon will meet with another sovereign or king to do something important from this panel here. This could possibly mean bringing the fishmen to the surface or save the world from another giant flood that is going on, but whatever the truth actually is, Shirahoshi's power to command these giant creatures is by itself truly terrifying, and if she wanted, she could probably just order them to, sink all the ships that, they can find. And then of course we have the third ancient weapon. Who knows if there might be more hidden, but for now it's 3. Uranus, and the basic facts here are still pretty sparse. Vegapunk basically seems to speculate that Imu's flying death ray weapon laser that destroyed Lucia was an ancient weapon, so it does kind of make sense that it would be Uranus, given that we know where Poseidon and Pluton are. Uranus is the only one left. On top of that, we now also know that the Mother Flame energy source that Vegapunk has invented based on the Eternal Flame from the Ancient Kingdom technology is actually needed to power an ancient weapon or this flying weapon that is used to destroy the island. But beyond that, Uranus facts are about as solid as Shanks beating Mihawk using pure swordsmanship. Not very, because one of these guys has a black blade and the other doesn't, just saying. And these swords are some of the most mysterious in the entire story. I just moved on to black blades, just to be clear, right? So far, only 2 of these have been confirmed, and those are Mihawk's Yoru and Shusui, the legendary blade of the samurai Ryuma from Wano, the swordsman legend. And even though Oda has never officially confirmed how someone actually turns a sword into a legendary black blade, we do have some pretty strong theories about how that might actually work. The most popular idea is that this happens when a swordsman infuses so much of their haki and willpower into a weapon for such a long time with such skill that the blade itself permanently changes and gets infused with that swordsman willpower. Basically, the sword kind of remembers and stores some of its powerful user's energy. And another idea is that the sword somehow actually becomes alive and gains some sort of will of its own. But don't worry, if there's something cool about swords in One Piece, then you do know that Zoro will absolutely pull it off somehow at some point, and we will find out when that happens for sure. And actually, since Ryuma, and I guess to a certain extent at least, Zoro also comes straight from Wano, let's stick around here for just a moment, because that place wasn't just about legendary samurai swinging swords, of course. No. Under Orochi and Kaido, Wano basically turned into a weapons factory for the entire world, like the, I guess, underworld, but they even sold stuff to the government, we learned. They enslaved all of the legendary craftsmen from the country and set them to making swords, guns, and other weapons that they then sold through Doflamingo and the underworld to anyone who needed some, basically. And yes, they were just cranking stuff out left and right, but that wasn't the only thing special about the weapons created in Wano, because they had this very unique material called liquor iron ore that we kind of assume makes their blades and gear way more tough and strong than anything you'd find anywhere else in the world. For example, the Revolutionary Army even used this metal to trace the weapons back to their source because it is so unique and special. And speaking of weapons that are pretty much anything but normal, we've gotta also talk about Big Mom's arsenal, specifically since we just came from Kaido, because she doesn't just swing around any old regular boring sword. No, she went and infused her hat sword Napoleon with pieces of her own soul to make it a living, breathing weapon that can drastically increase and change its size whenever she needs it. Of course, she then also has her other fiery sun homie Prometheus, her old cloud Zeus, who now actually hangs out with Nami, and her new cloud Hera, who she created during the battle in Onigashima. Now, if we're talking really crazy weapons though, we of course can skip over Enel's Arc Maxine, because this thing wasn't just a ship. It was basically a flying doomsday machine by itself. It is powered by jet dials and juiced up so much by Enel's lightning devil fruit that Enel could channel his powers through the Arc to summon storms big enough to wipe Skypiea clean off the map, kind of making his own Uranus. And actually, Enel wasn't just gonna stop there. His whole plan was to ride this golden monster all the way to the moon, which even more crazy, he actually somehow pulled off. The Arc Maxime straight up survived space travel. That makes it one of the most absurdly overpowered and unique ships/weapons that we have seen in the story to this day, hundreds of chapters later. Now, Enel may actually have gotten the idea for this ship from the distant past because there's a very similar looking ship in the mural that he found on the moon. But now, before we do wrap up level 2 of the Iceberg and go really deep, we gotta talk about the weapons that don't quite fit neatly into this swords and gun category like the clear-cut molds, because One Piece actually is full of some other wild weapon like types, including some pole arms, clubs, flails, and hammers that actually, absolutely wreck shop too. Let's look at some examples, shall we? Take Dalton's spade here, for example. The dude transforms into a bison and charges straight at you with a giant shovel as his weapon of choice, which kind of cool, I guess. It's not just creative, it is actually terrifying if it's a living, intelligent bull that wields it, I guess. And then you also have Ulti swinging around her Morningstar mace like it's no big deal at all, slamming people into the ground with some bone-crushing force. And of course, we can't talk about weapons like these and forget the king of clubs himself, Kaido, rocking a massive Kanabo, which is this thing right here. This spiked monster is practically a character of its own at this point. And then we also have some flails that really don't get enough shine with the 7th Division commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, Rakuyo, who uses this ball and chain that kind of looks like it's alive as well. We also have the dual-weighted chains used by this fishman, which just shows just how versatile that category truly is. But the big daddy here is without a doubt this one. The one and only, the true greatest weapon in One Piece history, Usopp's 5-ton hammer. I think we can both agree that it does not get any better than this piece of pure savage brutality. But if you wanted to look at another slightly less cool hammer, then there's also, I guess, Loki's hammer Ragnir. Not quite as cool as Usopp's hammer, but when this thing comes crashing down with a bolt of lightning the size of a literal mountain, it instantly cemented itself as one of the most terrifying weapons in the series. Not subtle, not very delicate, just pure, giant, destructive power. But now, it's truly time to strap on your tinfoil diving gear because we are taking this iceberg down to the next level, which I'm calling the Weapon Master lore, where we'll be discussing weapon facts and theories that even veteran One Piece fans may not have actually heard of yet. And to deliver on that promise right away, first up, you've got the Kitetsu family, the mad geniuses who created the Cursed Blades. The earliest one that we know about is Kotetsu, who actually crafted the Nidai Kitetsu. What's even crazier is that Kotetsu is actually an ancestor of the Kozuki family, which ties swordsmithing directly into the heart of Wano's history. I hear my cat calling. I'll be right back. Now, speaking of the Kozuki, let's talk about Kozuki Sukiyaki. This man forged the Sandai Kitetsu and the legendary Ame no Habakiri, the sword passed down to Momonosuke. Are you telling me you already want to go out now again? Meow. Alright. That was a very short visit, my friends. Where was I? Oh, right, weaponsmiths. Alright. Then there's the most random one of the bunch with Fugetsu Kisaburo. He's the one who forged Fujitora's supreme grade blade, Yakuza Kazen. That alone makes him a giant in sword history, but I think most people just don't even know his name in One Piece. And then, of course, we have the big one, Shimotsuki Kozaburo. He's the guy who forged 2 of Zoro's current blades, the Wado Ichimonji and Enma. But then he actually left Wano, came to the East Blue, and settled in Shimotsuki village with the rest of the Wano refugees, and that means that Zoro's entire journey is quite literally tied back to this one legendary swordsmith who connected Wano to the outside world that he's actually also related to. Naturally, this now brings us right into one of the coolest, creepiest parts of sword lore in One Piece, which are cursed blades directly tied to this clan. We first were introduced to the basics of cursed blades early on in Loketown, where we learned that these swords basically have a will of their own and are, to a certain degree, bloodthirsty. Of course, we know that Zoro instantly tamed his own cursed sword, but usually they end up sending their user into a bloodlust that eventually even kills the user, kind of Elder Wand, Voldemort, Harry Potter style. The most famous line is of course the Kitetsu blades themselves. You've got the Shodai Kitetsu, Nidai Kitetsu, and Sandai Kitetsu that Zoro picked up way back in Loketown, and each one is cursed to bring death to its own wielder. But Kitetsu isn't the only cursed blade in One Piece, and it's actually kind of shocking how little has been said about these swords being cursed. A prime example that I think people don't know about is Kikoku, Trafalgar's Law's massive Nodachi sword. And if you're learning this for the first time while watching this right now, then I promise you are not alone with this one, because Oda only very recently revealed this information in an SBS. Now, we've never seen Law act super bloodthirsty with the sword, so maybe the quote-unquote curse of the sword is not that it is a death-hungry demon sword and it is cursed in maybe another way instead, or maybe Law is just, got it under such good control that it never even acts up a little bit. And under normal circumstances, this is where I would just end this section of confirmed cursed swords, but I do want to throw two more out here at this point because, goddamn, I can't shake the idea that Rai is also a cursed blade, right? In case you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the sword of the former jailer of Impel Down, Shiryu of the Rain, and the reason that I think that this one is cursed specifically is because Shiryu himself is a savage monster who kills people for fun, so, I kind of see him as someone who gave into his cruel blade instead of controlling it like Zoro did, maybe even with the sword corrupting him while Zoro mastered his. A very fitting parallel, of course, since these two very likely will be fighting once the Straw Hats finally duke it out with the Blackbeard Pirates. And then there is actually one other completely unexplained mystery with one of the members of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, which is Cavendish and his weapon. Because if you remember, if you don't, it's fine, One Piece is very long, a lot of stuff has happened, but if you remember, this dude turns into a murderous psychopath with insane strength whenever he falls asleep. And I can't help but wonder if this is some sort of curse from his sword Durendal as well, which has been speculated quite often too. I mean, we've seen some absolutely freaky things with swords having their own will, so the sword being the thing that contains Hakuba would make a lot of sense to me, especially since Oda has kind of grown fond of illustrating swords as people. In case you don't know, we have art for all three of Zoro's swords as people too. But yeah, Cavendish sword, that thing's got some very serious cursed energy, but now let's jump back into one of the biggest mysteries in One Piece lore in general, the ancient weapon Uranus. We're not done with it, because while we only know a small bit about it, there are some amazing theories what it could actually be, and we kind of gotta wrap things up with the ancient weapons here. Check this out. Some fans think that Uranus could be an actual living creature, maybe even a dragon. Because if you know Oda, you should know that he loves his groups of threes. 3 types of devil fruits, 3 branches of Haki, and yes, 3 ancient weapons. And if we look at these weapons, we can see that one is already a person, that's Poseidon. Another is said to be a ship of some sort, but is also said to be sleeping under Wano. So I do think it would make some sense to complete the trio with Uranus being some sort of animal creature too. And it turns out there's actually a perfect candidate for this creature that's been hiding in the flashbacks for many years, because just look at that glorious, giant, mysterious egg that we first saw on Roger's ship. This thing has been around for a while, and it has quite literally never been explained. We've never seen it again, we don't know where it came from or where it went, so it's very possible that it hatched into a creature that now roams the skies under Imu's control. But as you can imagine, this is not the only very impressive Uranus theory out there, because another way to look at the group of ancient weapons is a person with Poseidon, and then there's the idea that Pluton could be a whale or some other creature living under Wano, right? So there's the animal creature, which might leave Uranus to be some sort of object or machine, and this idea fits perfectly with the fact that Imu needed Dr. Vegapunk specifically to create the Mother Flame, an energy source, to activate their ancient weapon. Or yet another idea that I've talked about before is that each of the ancient weapons could be combinations of a person and a creature and a machine, right? Where the person controls the creature and then the creatures, pull or manage the machine. This obviously fits very well with Shirahoshi and the Sea Kings and the Noah, but there's also lots of speculation about Momonosuke being the one to control Pluton, since he's the new shogun of Wano and is controlling Zunisha, a giant elephant. All I'm saying is, don't be surprised if there's another person who controls Uranus as well. But of course, all of this doesn't explain one other major problem about the ancient weapons, which is how in the world do they cause the sea levels to rise as well? Because there's this whole thing with Vegapunk speculating that the ancient weapons are responsible for the rising of the sea levels around the world now and in the past by 200 meters, and that's how the world was flooded, and how most of ancient history was just kind of, rinsed away. The basic idea is that every time one of these things is used, the ocean levels might rise higher. We saw something like that actually happen after Lulusia was destroyed, with the sea levels rising by 1 meter around the globe, but how does this even work? Is it some sort of reaction within the planet? Is it a sea god trying to wipe out the world because an ancient weapon has been used? Or is it simply the fact that the weird hole left behind by Uranus displaces so much water that the levels rise around the rest of the planet because it goes so deep down? I'm not saying it's impossible, it is, but wow, that would be a lot of water, and that would mean that this hole would be very deep, going all the way to the core maybe. One thing I do know though is that you can get your hands on the ultimate weapon for any One Piece fan by joining my official Ohara Patreon and support the channel and what we do here with these long breakdowns like this very video, which, as you can imagine, takes a lot of time and effort to put together. Researching it, writing it, recording it, editing it, like a lot of work goes into these videos, so everyone who chooses to support us really makes a big difference. Thank you to everyone who already does so. If you're thinking about it, we have a ton of really cool perks. We have bonus content, we have a weekly newsletter for free, by the way, that you can just have, without pledging anything. We have behind the scenes, our artwork, and a lot more, including, by the way, your name at the end of every video. So if you want to support videos like these, we want to make more of these deep dives and breakdowns, you can check it out there. And yes, big thank you. That being said, and the bills being paid, and a big shout out to the Patreons, let's return to the iceberg. Now, if Uranus already has your head spinning, let's crank it up even a little bit further. Because one thing that we cannot forget at this level of the weapons iceberg is that the ancient kingdom technology is way more advanced than what is in the One Piece world active today. I think the best example for this that we've got is the giant robot Emeth from 900 years ago that came crashing into Marijua. This thing sat dormant for centuries, waiting, and the moment that the drum of liberation returned to the world, it woke back up finally. And here's the really wild question. If one ancient robot survived, are there gonna be other things? Like just a bunch of these massive powerful machines scattered across the world, waiting for the next Joy Boy to arrive and just flip the switch? If that were to be true, then they would be the single most powerful weapons in the entire world, given that they could actually put up a fight against even monsters like the Gorosei with their invulnerability and their extreme speed regeneration powers. Alright, but moving on, we talked about the Supreme Great Blades in level 1 already, so it's time to discuss the Great Blades next. And dropping a tier down doesn't mean dropping the hype here, because the Nidai Kitetsu is the second Kitetsu blade we can talk about, and it's deadlier than Zoro's first cursed sword, and when it was revealed in Wano, I think we all kind of just assumed that Zoro would at some point pick it up, but nope. After the climax of Wano, it was then returned to Sukiyaki. Zoro himself shouldn't really complain though, because he already has 2 other Great Blade swords in his possession, starting with the Wado Ichimonji. This thing here is of course Zoro's most treasured sword, the same blade that Kuina once wielded, and carries insane emotional weight and cutting power as well. I'd even argue that it's possible that Zoro's legend with this sword grows so much that it will be the first one to eventually become a Supreme Great Blade. I mean, sure, we still don't know exactly how these swords even are graded to begin with, but it's not like a sword is just graded once it is made and then never again. So I certainly think that it's absolutely possible for swords to move up tiers depending on the user. And then there's also Zoro's newest blade, Enma, which is a blade with such a strong will of its own that it straight up forces out its wielder's haki. Meaning that if you don't have expert control over your own haki, then it will just suck you dry like a raisin in no time, so basically forces you to get really good or it will kill you, which might straight up be how its original owner Kozuki Oden got so powerful too. Then we've also got Shusui, the sword once wielded by the legendary samurai Ryuma. And this sword is so unbelievably hyped up that it's considered a Wano national treasure. And finally, the last great that we actually know of is Ame no Habakiri. This was Kozuki Oden's second sword alongside Enma and is said to be able to cut through the heavens themselves, and it now belongs to Oden's son, Momonosuke. Next, let's also hit up on a couple of these skillful great Meito blades too that we know. And what's maybe most crazy is that we only actually know 2 of these swords in the actual canon story. First is Kashu, a sword owned by Smoker's right-hand woman Tashigi. She's of course someone all about collecting named swords so that they don't get misused, and Kashu is one that she took from Baroque Works agent Mr. 11 after he was killed. Just to be clear though, this is not a sword that she uses straight up on a day-to-day basis, she just, collects it. And then there is Yubashiri, one of the swords that Zoro got from Ippon Matsu back in Loketown. This thing actually became one of his main blades for a quite long stretch of time before getting them tragically rusted away at Enies Lobby by this marine guy right here. And moving on, we're gonna go a little bit off track here because this next topic is something that we've basically never seen in One Piece before ever before the current story events, and it's not even straight up a weapon in the traditional sense, it's more of a war strategy. So editor, please cue up that clip from my favorite battle in all of fiction. Alright, that's my Lord of the Rings fix for the day, but in One Piece there is a different battle, a final battle that takes place on a much longer timescale because at this point the Revolutionary Army has been cutting off food supplies to the Holy Land for quite some time. And things have been starting to get a little bit dicey. The nobles are upset that they can't have their favorite foods, but things seem to be heating up here as well because the revolutionaries' tactics even have Emu pissed off enough that he is demanding his best warriors come back to defend their homelands. Now you might rightfully say that this is not straight up a weapon in the traditional sense, but this siege plan that Dragon has cooked up is one tactic that seems to have had the greatest effect on Marijoa and the Celestial Dragon that we've ever seen in the story. And if the revolutionaries are out here storming Marijoa with old school siege tactics, the world government might just answer with something straight out of a sci-fi nightmare instead. I'm talking about the new and now improved Pacifistas Mark III. We of course already talked about the OG Pacifista back at Sabaody and then Marineford. Those were terrifying enough with their own cybertronic strength and laser beams, but these new models now also come equipped with bubble shields that are basically indestructible. I mean, you're not just gonna break through these things with a sword swing or a cannon blast. These shields make them basically, immune to any damage unless you're like a top tier fighter like Venus Juro here, who was able to take them out basically instantaneously. And as we saw during Ekid Island, there is a pretty complicated chain of command for these Pacifista, as you can see right here. At the bottom is anyone holding the authority chip, but then these orders can actually be overwritten by anyone with a higher authority level. And this order from the bottom starts with Vegapunk's bodyguard Sentomaru, then any of the Vegapunks themselves, then the Gorosei, and finally there's actually Juroibani, who Vegapunk secretly programmed to actually have the highest level control over the Kuma-based Pacifista models in the end. But here's the wild part. These Pacifista weren't even Vegapunk's first cloning experiments. Before those metal giants, the world government was out here trying something even crazier, cloning dragons to use as their own personal living weapons. Yeah, because if you remember, in Punk Hazard, we met these dragons that Vegapunk had been successfully creating on orders of the government. But even though he successfully made a living, working, functioning dragon, dragon number 13 here was not exactly powerful if it could just get easily washed by Straw Hats in Punk Hazard. And that actually raises some pretty big other questions. Like, I actually wonder how powerful the real dragons were in the One Piece world when they were still around. We already do know for a fact that dragons existed in the past because Ryuma here, the sword god himself, we talked about him, literally slayed one in Wano's history. So were the ones in the past actually strong enough to be made into legend? And is that why the world government was trying to recreate them so desperately? And how did they get extinct in the first place? I'd certainly believe that these things were beyond powerful, and the really twisted part is that if dragons once ruled the skies before the celestial dragons claimed their thrones, then I can easily believe that people wiped them out at one point in the past too, just, to gain control of the world. It may have even been the 20 kingdoms that formed the world government, since they took the symbol of the hoof of the flying dragon as the world noble symbol right here that's also branded on their slaves. And this would kind of make sense with how the world government has also tried to wipe out the Buccaneers and the Lunarian tribe. So by recreating dragons now, it's basically the government saying, yeah, we do know we wiped you all out in the past, but you were pretty strong, so let's bring you back as our slaves to, fight for us this time. But of course, making dragons wasn't the only secret government experiment that was taking place on Punk Hazard anyways. It was also the place where they conducted their gigantification experiments, basically trying to create their own armies full of people turned into giants and ancient giants, and it does seem like everyone thinks that this is the ultimate weapon out there because we've seen this desire pop up all over the place. From failed government experiments to Big Mom's bankrolling Caesar to find the secret, and even Kaido's numbers, who seem like they were early prototypes in this research before Kaido purchased them to be part of his own pirate crew. We've been told multiple times by different people that giants are the ultimate battlefield monsters, and if anyone ever cracks the code, that army would be unstoppable, and it's also the main reason everyone's going so crazy about Elbaf right now. And then we've got the Lunarians, who honestly might be the biggest walking cheat code in the entire series altogether. Their durability, their insane stamina, and that unique flame on their backs is all like some sort of super weapon all on its own. And honestly, with all the focus on technology and science from the distant past, I've always wondered if this was yet another power that was scientifically created, and we're only now seeing the last bits of it remaining in the One Piece world with Kaido's right-hand man, King. And now, before we finish level 3, let's hit on some more of the most obscure weapon types in the story. These are basically the weapons that you never pick in an RPG game, like the whip, though that kind of goes hard, not gonna lie. And we have seen a few in the story, like with Sadie from Impel Down, and the only named whip in the story with Kujaku's whip, Beethoven, who uses her whip with her devil fruit to make anything she hits obey her. And right next to whips on the list of obscure weapons are fist weapons. And no, I'm not talking about raw knuckles here, but more like your weapons that enhance your punching damage, like Miss Monday for example, or Black Maria with her brass knuckles, which again, look pretty cool. I've got a pretty based weapon. Alright, but with that we've now officially made it down to level 4 of the Iceberg, which I'm gonna call the Forbidden Knowledge level. And it's called Forbidden for a good reason, because if you actually know everything we're gonna talk about in this tier of knowledge, then you probably have a pretty unhealthy obsession with the anime One Piece. Not that I'm like that at all. No, totally not obsessed with this silly little pirate story. So let's kick things off with the ancient weapons once again, but this time from a perspective that you might not have ever thought about. Because for so long, the ancient kingdom and the ancient weapons were pretty much considered to go hand in hand. In fact, based on the naming scheme, you probably even believe that the ancient weapons were made by the ancient kingdom, but here is where you might be wrong. You see, when we say ancient weapons, the Japanese term that Oda uses for ancient is Kodai, which actually does mean ancient, as in long before recorded history. But when we talk about the ancient kingdom, Oda doesn't use that word at all. Instead, in Japanese, he uses the adjective Kyodai, or basically the great or vast kingdom, and this is a huge difference because it means that we can't really associate the two as being the same kind of ancient, which kind of tells me that the ancient weapons are pretty much guaranteed to be probably a lot older than even the ancient kingdom itself. Except for maybe Pluton, which we do know was built at some point at Water 7 during the White Century, most likely by the giant shipbuilding clan Galela. And if that's the case, then we're not just talking about relics from 800 years ago, we're talking about Poseidon and Uranus possibly being around for thousands of years in the One Piece world, maybe even to the time when the original Nika was still dancing under the sun in the first world. Which is pretty insane because it likely means that these two ancient weapons might have been created by some god-tier beings instead of technologically created by a super advanced kingdom, or it might have been both, that these gods were really technologically advanced, maybe from the moon, that then came down to colonize Earth, as we learn in Enel's cover story. Then we do know that all three of them were used during the war between Joy Boy and the 20 Kingdoms, it seems, and then after he knew that he was going to be defeated most likely, Joy Boy had some role in preserving them for the future and hiding them away. But if some or all of the ancient weapons actually end up predating the ancient kingdom, then we also kind of have to ask ourselves, where did they really come from? Because maybe the answer, as I just mentioned earlier, isn't Earth at all. Maybe it's way, way above the blue One Piece planets. And that's where Enel's cover story finally comes in. Remember when he took off to the moon and we all thought it was just, this goofy side gag? Yeah, no. He found robots, ancient technology, and then, oh yeah, some space pirates too. Space pirates in One Piece. That means that there are entire civilizations out there with technology so far beyond what we've seen on the Blue Sea, and their descendants might have settled in the Sky Island, since we do know that the Moon Kingdom is named Burka, just like the Sky Island where Enel and the Rouge are from originally. So I wonder that if the ancient in the ancient weapons is really that old, then it's probably not a stretch to think that some of this stuff might be straight up extraterrestrial tech, maybe used to terraform the world. It would even bring together the idea that the people, or at least the winged people from the blue planet, originally came from space once they harvested all of their resources and the moon basically ran out. And actually, speaking of technology that feels way too advanced for the One Piece world altogether, let's actually drop back down from the moon for a moment and talk about the end game of lineage factor manipulation, because I think this might straight up be the single most OP weapon in the final saga. Because just imagine this. So far we've seen cloning with the Germa soldiers, the Kuma Pacifista, and even more terrifyingly with the Seraphim. But here's the true nightmare endgame of all of this: an army of absolutely perfect super clones. Think about it. If the world government now has the knowledge to create Lunarian-like clones, then what's stopping them from making way more of them? I'm talking about clones with Lunarian durability, green blood running through their veins giving them devil fruit powers, and are mass-produced like the Germa clones. Basically a whole army of Seraphim on crack. That would be kind of insane. If they were all as strong as the current Seraphim already, who are powerful enough to challenge top-tier characters like Luffy and Zoro, then I can just imagine a huge army of clones wiping out the entire pirate world. Like, kind of imagine Star Wars clone troopers, but if every single one of them was basically admiral level. That type of force would even make people like Kaido or Big Mom look like small fries. And if the world government is actually heading in this direction, which it really seems like they are, then Luffy and the heroes will need something absolutely spectacular to even stand a chance. Though of course this strongly depends on whether Vegapunk was maybe even able to hide all that research from the government before, he got away on Egghead Island. And if you thought that an army of admiral level clones was sounding terrifying, let's now talk about something even scarier and way more hype in my opinion, because there's a major possibility that the One Piece itself isn't just treasure or a funny message from Joy Boy, like a funny gag, but an actual world-breaking weapon or device. I want you to really think about it. We do know at least part of the One Piece is something left behind by Joy Boy, but Roger was there way too early to use it. So it could be a storehouse of ancient tech, maybe even more giant robots like Emmet that need to be awakened by Luffy's Drum of Liberation heartbeat to actually work. I mean, that would certainly classify as a spectacular army to take on an army of super clones if you ask me, and would look pretty epic. But the One Piece treasure could be a bunch of other weapon related stuff as well. Remember how powerful Joy Boy's Haki Knot was that he had stored inside of Emmet? It blasted all the Gorosei way back to Marijua and even affected Imu. Well, what if there's even more of these leftover Haki weapons that were all part of Joy Boy's plan to eventually take down the big guy Imu? Or maybe Laugh Tale has other advanced weapons that we can't even imagine, or an entire vault of never before seen powerful devil fruits. And before we move on from this, I do want to quickly circle back once again to the Haki Knot that Emmet specifically released in Egghead Island, and this was undoubtedly one of the top 2 or maybe even 3 strongest attacks in the series, with Joy Boy's unleashed Haki Blast even making Imu wet the bed halfway across the world. But the truly shocking thing is that this is actually not the first time that we've seen not storing power in the story, because you might remember that during the time skip, Nami landed on this island full of weather scientists and she discovered that they had something called wind knots, which is basically just what it sounds like, right? You know, store some wind in the knot, untie the knot, and bam, you have a gust of air. Simple grade school level experiment, right? We've all done it. Yeah. Well, this knot might have some true significance going forward, with most of the remaining Vegapunks now all going to Witheria as well. Plus, there's connections between Weaving Threat and the famous pirate song Bing Sake, you know, the spinning village and everything. So yeah, we could very well be learning just how important and powerful knots are very soon, and maybe you can even use Haki to weave actual physical objects from it. And speaking of weapons that could flip the entire One Piece world upside down, let's now talk about something a little bit more recent, because while the idea of Laugh Tale holding some kind of hidden doomsday tech is still pure theory, Shamrock's Cerberus sword specifically is right in front of us and already has been making some pretty big waves. This thing is absolutely wild. I mean, it's literally a blade that sprouts 3 snarling Cerberus heads to chomp down on enemies. Like, who gave Shamrock the keys to the demon pet shop, please? Cerberus versus Chocho confirmed, by the way. Now, this thing isn't exactly hidden knowledge, of course, but since it's still so new in the story, there are some pretty wild theories about what this thing actually is and what it can actually do. The most obvious possibility is that it's another one of these weapon-type devil fruit hybrids that we've seen in the past, so basically Shamrock's sword ate the Cerberus fruit. But then there's also always the possibility that this is more of Imu's creepy demon magic creeping into the story and into the sword, and hey, there's even the option that these powers don't even come from the sword at all, but this is all just straight up part of Shamrock's own devil fruit powers instead. But I do have one other idea that I bet you've never thought about, and it comes from just the freakish way that the Cerberus looks like it's being straight up unleashed from a cage. And so I've been thinking, what if this is what's actually happening here? This is a real Cerberus that has been trapped inside the sword, and Shamrock just releases it to do his own dirty work. Or maybe it's not as much trapped in the sword, but more inside the freaky abyss power that the Holy Knights all seem to have access to, this like pocket dimension thing. Pretty crazy, I admit, but could be really fun. So, after talking about a sword that literally grows 3 dog heads now, let's flip it over to the craziest sword theory of them all. And yes, I am talking about the idea of Luffy possibly getting his very own sword and using it actually properly this time, like a real swordsman. And I know that this idea sounds really crazy, but do hear me out for a second. We have seen Luffy grab a sword here and there in the story. On Wano, for instance, he did throw some punches while holding the Nidai Kitetsu, and don't forget Nightmare Luffy back in Thriller Bark, where Luffy absorbed the shadow of a swordsman and was suddenly an expert with the blade. But here's where it gets really interesting. Every time Oda has drawn that mysterious Nika or Joy Boy silhouette, the figure is holding a weapon. Sometimes a spear, sometimes a shield, sometimes even a sword, and sometimes a combination of these things. In other words, it seems a lot like Nika and or Joy Boy have both been using swords in the past, so is Luffy really gonna break that pattern? I don't know, man. It's very possible with his Gear 5 powers that he just straight up pulls out some wild, cartoonish, powerful blade that bends and stretches with him. That would be some peak chaos energy too. I mean, Gear 5 is all about the power of imagination. So what if he just imagined that he could actually use a sword? And speaking of weird swords, let's really scale things up a little bit now, like way up, because if you thought that Luffy picking up a sword was already wild, wait until we start talking about the largest swords in the entire story. Because you see, Oda tends to be a little bit of a cheeky artist. Sometimes he'll just put something absolutely absurd in the background of the story and just let us wonder about it for many years. A prime example of this is Onigashima here, which had this absolutely gigantic katana just kind of chilling there right in front of the entrance. No explanation, no context, nothing. Like, whose sword was that? Did it belong to the owner of the enormous skull that makes up Onigashima? Because based on its size, the super giant skeleton here might be the only thing in Wano big enough to actually use a katana of this enormous scale. But Onigashima's mystery blade has nothing on the real beast, because over in Elbaf, Oda revealed an even bigger sword that literally puts entire mountains to shame. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that this thing might be the largest weapon we've ever seen in the story ever. Elbaf is the biggest island that we know about, and this sword easily towers above it. And I just have absolutely no clue who could have used this. Like, Surely nothing is that big, right? Unless of course the sword was just gigantified somehow, but whatever the truth is, it's a real Chekhov's giant sword type of move by Oda, and it does feel like he's teasing us with something absolutely colossal here, and I can't wait to find out what this is all about because, oh boy, it's definitely gonna get a crazy payoff. And maybe more importantly is if this sword actually has a grade. Is there a extra super large Mato category that's like secret and we've never been told about? We'll have to see on that one. But there is a huge group of swords you probably know about but may not have known that they're actually Mato grade weapons. You see, we have this giant list that you can see on screen right here, but Oda hasn't even told us their grade yet. And some of these are in the hands of absolute legends and they are named swords. The most obvious one of these has to be Shanks's Griffon. We have seen it in action a few times now, but never got confirmation of what its actual rank is. I mean, yeah, come on. I mean, if the guy is actually a literal Yonko who's swinging around this thing, you better believe it's absolute top tier probably. I'd be shocked if it wasn't at least supreme grade, right? Then we've got Ryu, the sword that Shiryu carries. Now this one feels important because Blackbeard's crew is just stacked with really dangerous tools and really powerful people, and if Shiryu's blade is secretly cursed or really high grade, it's gonna be terrifying when he eventually clashes with Zoro. We also can't forget Napoleon, Big Mom's living sword. Whether you call it a homie or a blade, it's still one of the craziest weapons in the entire show. And then there's also Yamato's Takeru, a massive Kanabo club that might not be as famous as Kaido's, yes, but the potential is absolutely still there. Actually, I'm a little bit curious how Yamato's Kanabo is even considered a blade since it literally has no sharp points, except I guess, you know, the little thorns, but I think it is what it is. Then you've got Cracker's Pretzel, Katakuri's Trident Mogura, and even Brook's blade, Soul Solid. The point is, there are tons and tons of weapons in One Piece that are of super high quality, have a name, and we don't still exactly know what rank they really are. And I don't know, maybe they're just saving this for a big merch drop someday, or something stupid like a complete Mato encyclopedia. Wait a second, okay. Sign me up, I would buy the hell out of it. Okay, actually I kind of want them to make this now. This sounds really cool. Anyways, what I won't be buying is this absolutely devastating next category of weapons though. We're talking about poisons, chemicals, and yes, even biological weapons. And what's actually crazy is just how often this type of weapon actually shows up in the story. I mean, Crocodile had some poison right in his golden hook. Krieg blasted deadly chemicals in his MH5 cannonballs. Then we've got the Weapons of Mass Destruction King himself, Caesar Clown, whose chemical warfare is just on a whole different level. In case you don't remember, he made the deadly gas that almost wiped out all the Minks on Zou. And he also built the KX launchers that he thought were strong enough to take down a monster like Big Mom. Though I will say we all know now how that hypothesis turned out in the end. But some even more terrifying chemical warfare happened in Wano, where we saw Queen unleash some of the scariest battlefield tools in the entire story. The mummy virus in Udon prison nearly killed Luffy himself. And then Queen doubled down with the Ice Oni virus in Onigashima, which turned allies into uncontrollable monsters. And we can really all thank our homeboy Marco, and I guess Chopper too, for saving the day on that one. But possibly the weapon that's affected the single most people in the entire One Piece story is one that you'd never expect, because classic old propaganda might be the single thing that has enslaved the most people in the world. And yes, big news, Big Bird Morgans here is truly the top one of this, you know, in the One Piece world, but the government itself will lie, twist, and make up stories to protect themselves and control the entire population. I mean, just take what they reported about Sabo during the Reverie. They said that the revolutionary chief of staff killed Vivi's dad Cobra, but clearly that, you know, was not the case. But the rest of the world doesn't know that, which just feeds perfectly into the world government's hands and into their narrative. And of course, they aren't the only ones spinning stories. We also saw Crocodile weave a web of lies to turn the people of Alabasta against the ruling family. Poor Cobra, he's really at the center of all of these. And if it wasn't for the Straw Hats, Crocodile would have taken over the entire kingdom while barely having to lift a finger himself, just by basically making up lies about the ruling family. So yeah, propaganda is a major weapon that can influence the entire world. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is now time because we're diving even deeper, deep down into the dark depths of level 5 of the weapon Iceberg. And I'm gonna call this level the Weapons of Mass Theory Brain because this is where things get truly unhinged. As in, these are the types of theories and facts about weapons that you're not sure if Oda actually planned it from the start or if we're just galaxy braining ourselves into oblivion while we're going, right? But either way, they're absolutely crazy fun to think about. But let's just start right away with one of the biggest and craziest ideas out there. What if the people of the One Piece world themselves are bioengineered weapons? Just think about that one for a second. We've got Lunarians who are so durable they basically can't be killed with flames that give them these godlike endurance and extreme speed. We've got Buccaneers like Kuma with natural giant-like strength baked into their bloodline. Then throw in fishmen, the regular giants, minks, long arms, snake necks. The list goes on and on and on. Just think all the crazy races in One Piece. So an idea that I found really fascinating for quite a while now is, what if all these unique, weird fantasy races weren't just evolutionary quirks, but actually the result of ancient bioengineering? Literal living weapons created way back during history. And if that were to be true, then it makes a lot of sense why everyone has been so obsessed with the idea of gigantification. Because if different races were created long ago, then it is reasonable that this could be done once again. We've practically seen this already with the Seraphim, but just imagine if all the world's unique and weird races that usually only exist in the Grand Line were actually somehow created this way. And just to add to this, we've recently learned that humans and giants can actually make babies together. Now, I know, don't ask me how, please, ask Scorpion, but it's a thing that is real in One Piece. And there's other races that can reproduce, like humans and dwarves, fishmen and humans, even giants and fishmen, it seems. So the idea that they can all interbreed really adds to the idea that they were all originally one race and were kind of changed and modified through science in the distant past. And if people themselves would basically be living weapons in One Piece, then you already know where we gotta go next, which are devil fruits. Now, for devil fruits, of course, their origin has always been one of the biggest mysteries in the entire story. We finally did get a clue when Vegapunk straight up told us that they're born from the hopes and dreams of people, but I've got a theory about devil fruits that will take things way further than anything you've possibly imagined. Because at this point, I think we can assume that devil fruits were made by someone or something, maybe it was the ancient kingdom using their technology, or some other godlike figures further in the past. Like the forest god who kind of sounds like he did that in the Harley in the Second World. But the thing that you've got to keep in mind is that the world itself basically rejects devil fruits to begin with. The ocean literally tries to kill devil fruit users, so it's almost like these are unnatural abilities that should not even exist in the real world. And this is where this theory gets actually wild. What if devil fruits weren't just about giving people crazy abilities, but were actually designed to fight against something very specific and also completely unnatural? Maybe something like ancient titans or some other dark gods, or I don't know, what else could they be used against? Oh, yeah, maybe Imu's creepy demon magic. But if that's true, then there's also a darker endgame lurking here for the story, because if Imu is ever gonna be defeated and their demon magic erased, then maybe that means that devil fruit might have to say bye-bye at the end of the story too. Kind of like bringing balance to the world and restoring it to its natural form, which means the only way to truly save everything might be for devil fruits to have to disappear from the story for good. Like, I don't know, the elves in Lord of the Rings have to leave for the Age of Humans and stuff like this. Could be for One Piece too. Not sure if that made a lot of sense. Anyways, speaking of origins, it's time to talk about where Imu actually gets their powers from. And there are a few possibilities that are always thrown around here. It could be a devil fruit, of course. Imu could be a literal god mentioned in the ancient texts. Not just the earth god that we learned about in the Harley, but maybe something even bigger and more powerful. But I do want to throw out one other possibility, and it all ties back to film Red. Check this out. In the movie, we were introduced to the demonic monster Todd Musica, which was so unlike basically everything and anything that we've ever seen in the canon story. It had this reality warping power, invulnerability, even the ability to grant the person who summoned it god tier powers too. But the crazy thing about all this is that Oda actually confirmed that there is gonna be something similar to Tot Musica in the canon story. And so to bring this all back to Imu, I'm kind of thinking that Imu might be like Uta in this specific case. They might have just been a regular person who summoned some sort of devil or demon and were granted insane abilities because of it. Think Wheel of Time, right? That would explain why Imu's presence and powers feel so different from every other villain we've ever met. And it would also explain how Imu seemed like he was a normal person back in the day. I mean, they knew Lily and were possibly friends or lovers with Joy Boy, known as Nerona, right? One of the 20 families. But then it all could have changed when they made an agreement with the cursed being. Of course, it could also be that Imu is like the Tot Musica creature and they give their powers to others. We've kind of seen some of that with the Gorosei and the Holy Knights. We've seen how all of them seem to be connected through the Abyss powers, which, you know, they kind of warp through too. So I don't know, maybe the Abyss is like a tether that connects them all to Imu, and Imu has put out these tether points all around the world that anyone connected to the Abyss can actually access. Either way, it is definitely something we can consider a weapon, I think. But now, let's hit the really big daddy of them all, the true game-changing weapon that won't just win a battle, but will reshape the entire One Piece world. I'm talking about the One Piece treasure itself. Because let's be real, the One Piece world is really weird. The red line cuts across the entire planet as the single biggest source of land. The calm belt feels like some artificial moat, and the Grand Line's weather is just broken on purpose. Looking at this planet, none of it is looking natural whatsoever, and it honestly feels completely designed. So here's the wild idea. What if the planet that we're seeing right now was actually terraformed in the ancient past? Maybe by a super ancient civilization from space, like the moon race that Enel met on the moon, or maybe by massive giants or even bigger than the ones on Elbaf, like Titans, and these could literally be the 4 gods mentioned in the Harley text who completely reshaped the world during an epic war in the distant past. We do see some of this in the mural, where we see some crazy advanced ancient technology and ancient town and industry in the First World. Now, if all of this were to be true, then it could mean that the One Piece treasure by itself is some way to turn the world back to its natural, actual state. You know, some sort of terraforming weapon. And since we already know that the ancient weapons pretty much caused the world to flood to begin with, I kinda imagine that they have something to do with this as well. Like, just imagine combining the ancient weapons into some ultimate terraforming engine with the ability to raise or lower the sea levels, reshape continents, and basically rewrite the entire map. It would be the ultimate weapon to completely change and free the world. I've actually made a theory in the past that the forest, earth, sun, and rain gods might all kind of be related to agriculture when you think about it, so it does make sense in my mind that they, or a weapon that they created, or, you know, some sort of technology, would have the ability to reshape an entire planet and make it inhabitable. But we're still gonna need to answer a ton of questions, like, is it Luffy's Nika powers what are actually needed to use the One Piece? And what happens to devil fruits at the end of the story? And what are the true god level fruits that will change the story forever? But lucky for you, I answer all of these questions and so much more in the ultimate One Piece devil fruit iceberg, which you can watch right here. As always, thanks for watching till the end. If you did, please leave me a sword emoji if you watched till the end. I'll know. I'll keep an eye out for you. And otherwise, yeah, thanks for watching, and thanks to all the Patreons we've got, and I will see you in the next long video.